There are moments in life when you discover who people truly are, not through their words or promises, but through their actions when things get difficult. I'm going to share with you a story about betrayal, yes, but more importantly, about discovering your own strength when everything falls apart. It's about what happens when the person who vowed to stand by you in sickness and in health chooses to walk away, and what comes after. My name is Helen Anderson. I'm 69 years old now, a retired professor of English literature. I spent 3 decades teaching the great works, Shakespeare, Austen, the Brontes, stories of love, loyalty, and human nature. I thought I understood these themes deeply through literature, but life, as it often does, taught me lessons no book ever could. I met Richard in 1978 at a faculty mixer at the university where I just started teaching. He was 31, a rising architect with an infectious enthusiasm for modernist design. I was 22, fresh out of graduate school, probably too young to be making life decisions, but convinced I'd found my soulmate. Richard was charming, ambitious, and he made me laugh. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony overlooking the Thames. We chose not to have children. Our careers were demanding, and we told ourselves we were enough for each other. For 35 years, I believed that was true. Our life together was comfortable, perhaps even enviable. Richard's architecture firm flourished, and I climbed the academic ladder, eventually becoming a full professor. We had a beautiful Victorian home in Oxford, took annual trips to Italy, hosted dinner parties where we debated everything from politics to poetry. Our friends called us the perfect couple. We called ourselves best friends. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to March 2015. I was 58 years old, still teaching 4 courses a semester. I'd noticed some changes over the previous months, small things that I'd brushed off as signs of aging or stress. My left hand would sometimes tremble when I was grading papers. I'd stumble occasionally on the stairs. My handwriting, once precise and elegant, had become smaller and more cramped. Students had started commenting that my voice seemed softer in lectures. One Tuesday morning, I couldn't button my blouse. My fingers simply wouldn't cooperate. That's when I knew something was genuinely wrong. The diagnosis came 3 weeks later after a battery of tests. Dr. Patel, a neurologist at John Radcliffe Hospital, sat across from me and Richard in her office. The spring sunlight streaming through the windows seemed cruelly beautiful as she said the words, "Early stage Parkinson's disease." I remember gripping the arms of the chair, feeling the room tilt. Parkinson's! I knew what that meant. I'd watched Katharine Hepburn's later films, seen the tremors, the difficulty moving. It was a progressive disease. It would only get worse. "How long do I have?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Mrs. Anderson, Parkinson's isn't a death sentence," Dr. Patel said gently. "With proper treatment and care, many patients live for decades. But I won't lie to you. It will be challenging. You'll need support." I turned to Richard. He was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. But when he looked up and met my eyes, he reached over and took my hand. "We'll face this together," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." I believed him. God help me, I believed him completely. The first few months weren't terrible. The medication helped control the symptoms. I could still teach, still function mostly normally. But Richard and I both knew this was just the beginning. We'd read the literature, attended the appointments. We understood that eventually I would need increasing levels of care. That's when I started noticing the changes in Richard. At first, they were subtle. He began working later, claiming big projects at the firm. Weekend trips to building sites became more frequent. When I asked him to accompany me to doctor's appointments, there was always something urgent that came up, a client meeting, a site inspection, a deadline. I tried not to feel hurt. His career was important, I told myself. I was being selfish, demanding too much attention. But then came the dinners he missed, the evenings when I'd cook something special, set the table, and wait. By 9 o'clock, I'd eat alone, my cooling dinner a silent accusation. When he finally came home, near midnight, he'd apologize quickly. "Major crisis at work, darling, you understand," before heading straight to his study. Our conversations became shorter, more functional. "Did you pay the electricity bill?" "We need milk." "I'll be home late tomorrow." The intimacy we'd shared for decades seemed to evaporate like morning mist. I convinced myself this was normal. Marriage goes through phases, I reasoned. We were both stressed. Once things settled down, we'd reconnect. Then came February 2016, a Friday evening. Richard arrived home earlier than usual, around 7, with someone I'd never met. "Helen, this is Ashley," he said, ushering in a young woman who couldn't have been much past 30. She had long blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and the kind of effortless beauty that requires no makeup. She wore fitted jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly medication. "Ashley just joined the firm as an intern architect," Richard continued, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard in months. "She's incredibly talented. I've invited her to use our dining table to spread out the blueprints for the Riverside project. You don't mind, do you?" What could I say? No, I don't want this woman in our home. I'd sound paranoid, jealous, unreasonable. "Of course not," I heard myself say. "Would you like some tea, Ashley?" "That would be lovely, thank you," Ashley replied, giving me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something in her gaze, pity mixed with a kind of smug assessment. She was sizing me up, I realized, comparing herself to me. She saw a 58-year-old woman with tremoring hands and graying hair, a woman whose body was betraying her. And next to Richard, still handsome at 63, distinguished with his salt and pepper hair and trim build, she must have wondered what he was doing with me. That first evening set a pattern. Ashley began coming to the house 3, sometimes 4 times a week, always for work. They'd spread blueprints across our dining table, their heads bent close together, voices low and intimate. Sometimes I'd hear Ashley laugh, a bright, youthful sound that seemed to fill the house with life I could no longer provide. I'd retreat to my study, trying to focus on grading papers or preparing lectures, but my hands would shake too much. Not from the Parkinson's, from rage and fear and humiliation. I knew what was happening. I wasn't naive, but confronting it meant admitting my worst fear, that I was losing my husband to a disease that made me less desirable, less vital, less worthy of love. So I said nothing. I played the gracious hostess when Ashley visited. I smiled and offered refreshments and pretended not to notice when Richard's hand lingered on her shoulder, or when their goodbye at the door lasted too long. The breaking point came on June 15th, 2016. I remember the date because it was our wedding anniversary, 36 years. I'd made reservations at our favorite restaurant, bought a new dress that I hoped would make me look less ill, less diminished. Richard came home at 6. I was already dressed, wearing makeup for the first time in weeks, determined to remind him of the woman he'd married. "Happy anniversary," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. He looked confused for a moment, then stricken. "Oh, Helen, I'm sorry, I forgot. I can't make it tonight. Ashley and I have to finish the presentation for the Morrison building. It's due Monday." Something inside me snapped. 36 years and he'd forgotten. Or more likely, he simply didn't care anymore. "It's our anniversary, Richard," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "Surely the presentation can wait one evening." "Don't be unreasonable," he replied, already heading toward the stairs to change. "This is a multi-million-pound project. You know how important this is to the firm." "And I'm not important?" He stopped on the 3rd step, his back to me. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, without turning around, he said quietly, "I'll make it up to you, I promise." But we both knew he wouldn't. And more painfully, we both knew I wouldn't demand that he try. That night, I sat alone at the restaurant I'd booked at a table set for two. I ordered wine and pretended to look at my phone while other couples celebrated around me. The waiter's pitying glances were almost unbearable. I left after one glass, unable to finish the meal I'd ordered. When I got home, the house was empty. Richard and Ashley were still working. I sat in the dark living room and allowed myself to cry for the first time since the diagnosis. Not because of the disease, I'd learned to accept that, but because the person who was supposed to love me through it had already abandoned me emotionally, even if he hadn't left physically. He came home after midnight. I was still sitting in the dark. "Helen, why are you sitting alone?" He sounded irritated, as if I was being dramatic. "Did you sleep with her?" I asked. The question came out calmer than I felt. The silence that followed told me everything. "I'm sorry," he finally said, not denying it, just sorry. "How long?" "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters to me." He sighed, the sound of a man cornered. 3 months since March, right after I'd started showing visible symptoms, the shuffling walk, the more pronounced tremor, right when I'd needed him most. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Richard continued, his voice taking on a defensive tone. "But Helen, you have to understand. This isn't the life I signed up for. We were supposed to grow old together, yes, but not like this. Not with you sick, dependent, needing constant care." "The vows said in sickness and in health," I reminded him, my voice shaking now. "I know what they said." He was angry now, finally showing real emotion. "But I was 30 when we got married. I didn't really understand what I was promising. I didn't know it would mean giving up my whole life to be a caretaker." "I have Parkinson's, Richard. I'm not dying. I'll probably live for decades." "Exactly," he said, and the bleakness in his voice chilled me. "Decades of watching you deteriorate, decades of helping you dress, feeding you, watching you lose yourself piece by piece. I can't do it, Helen. I'm sorry, but I can't." We didn't speak for 2 days after that. Richard slept in the guest room. We moved around each other like ghosts, both waiting for the other to say what needed to be said. Then, on a Sunday evening in late June, Richard asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. His posture was formal, almost businesslike. "I want a divorce," he said without preamble. "I've already spoken to a solicitor. I think it's better if we do this quickly and cleanly." I felt strangely numb. Part of me had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. "I'm in love with Ashley," he continued. "She makes me happy. She makes me feel young again, alive. I know the timing is terrible, and I know this makes me look like a bastard, but I'd rather be honest than stay in a marriage out of obligation." "Obligation?" I repeated. "That's what I am to you now? An obligation? You know what I mean. I can't be your husband and your caretaker. It's not fair to either of us." "Fair?" I said, tasting the bitterness of the word. "You're leaving your sick wife for a woman half your age, and you're concerned about fairness?" "I'll make sure you're taken care of," Richard said, pulling out some papers. "I've worked out a financial arrangement. You'll get half our savings, and I'll pay your medical expenses and give you a monthly allowance. I'll help you find a good caregiver. You won't have to worry about—" "I don't want your money," I interrupted. "I want my husband. The man who promised to stand by me." "That man doesn't exist anymore," Richard said quietly. "I'm sorry, Helen." "I truly am, but I can't sacrifice my happiness for a marriage that's already over." The divorce proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. Richard's solicitor was expensive and ruthless. Because the house had been purchased by Richard before our marriage, it remained his property. The savings we'd accumulated together were split, but it was less than I'd hoped. Richard's lawyer argued that since he'd earned significantly more than me throughout our marriage, the split should reflect our income disparity. I received a settlement of £180,000, half of what we'd saved together, plus a commitment that Richard would cover my medical expenses for the next 5 years and provide £1,500 monthly alimony. It sounded generous until you calculated the cost of living with a degenerative disease. The worst part wasn't the financial calculations. It was watching our life together be dismantled, friends choosing sides, shared possessions being divided with sticky notes and spreadsheets, the house I'd lived in for 20 years being packed into boxes while Richard and Ashley waited impatiently for me to leave. Ashley moved in before I'd even finished packing. I came back one afternoon to collect some books I'd forgotten, and she was already there, rearranging their living room. She had the grace to look embarrassed when she saw me. "Helen, I didn't expect you to—" "It's fine," I said, my voice flat. "This is your home now." As I gathered my books, I watched her in my peripheral vision. She was arranging fresh flowers in a vase I'd bought in Florence 15 years ago, wearing an apron I'd never worn, making herself at home in a life she'd stolen. "I hope you'll be very happy," I said as I headed for the door. I meant it to sound gracious, but it came out cold. Ashley followed me to the door. "Helen, I know you probably hate me, but I want you to know. Richard and we really do love each other. This wasn't just some affair. We're building a real life together." I turned to look at her properly for the first time. She was 32 years old, beautiful, healthy, full of optimism about a future with a man who'd abandoned his wife when she got sick. "Then I hope," I said carefully, "that you never get sick. Because now you know exactly what kind of man Richard is when that happens." Her smile faltered. I moved into a small one-bedroom flat in East Oxford. It was a third-floor walk-up, which was already difficult for me to manage, but it was what I could afford. The neighborhood was different from what I was used to, younger, louder, full of students and families rather than retired professionals. My new living room could have fit inside my old bedroom. I hired a part-time caregiver named Marjorie, a cheerful Jamaican woman in her 50s who came 3 mornings a week to help me with things I could no longer manage easily, buttoning clothes, preparing meals, cleaning. She was kind, but it wasn't the same as having a partner. At night, when the symptoms were worst, when my body locked up and tremors made sleep impossible, I was utterly alone. I resigned from the university. I'd hoped to continue teaching, but the Parkinson's made it impossible. My voice had grown too soft for lectures. My handwriting was illegible. Students had started requesting different advisors for their dissertations. The department accepted my resignation with kind words and a modest retirement package, but I knew the truth. I was being put out to pasture at 58, decades before I'd planned. The social fallout was perhaps the most painful. Richard and I had shared friends, couples we'd known for decades, dinner party regulars, people we'd traveled with. After the divorce, invitations dried up. Some people were frank about it. "It's just too awkward, Helen. We're friends with both of you, and it feels like taking sides." Others simply stopped calling. I learned who my real friends were. Janet, a colleague from the English department, never wavered. She visited every week, brought me books, sat with me in comfortable silence. Tom and Sarah, a couple we'd known since the 80s, made it clear they thought Richard's behavior was reprehensible and maintained our friendship despite the social complications. But most people disappeared. At a time when I needed community most, I found myself increasingly isolated. The worst moments came at night. The Parkinson's medications worked reasonably well during the day, but their effectiveness waned by evening. I'd lie in bed, my body rigid, small tremors rippling through my limbs, and think about Richard sleeping peacefully next to Ashley. I'd imagine him reaching for her in the night the way he used to reach for me. I wondered if he ever thought about me at all. Sometimes the bitterness was overwhelming. I'd fantasize about confronting Ashley, telling her exactly what kind of man she'd won, or I'd imagine Richard getting sick, karma finally catching up with him. These dark thoughts shamed me, but I couldn't seem to stop them. 6 months after the divorce, I hit my lowest point. It was Christmas Eve 2016. Janet had invited me for dinner, but I'd declined, not wanting to be the pitiful divorcee at someone else's family celebration. I sat alone in my flat, listening to carol singers on the street below, and genuinely wondered if life was worth living. The Parkinson's was progressing. Walking had become more difficult. My balance was poor. I'd fallen twice that month, once badly enough to bruise my ribs. The medications caused nausea and nightmares. I felt old, sick, and completely alone, but something happened that night that changed my trajectory. I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I came across a support group for Parkinson's patients meeting at a community center in Headington. The next meeting was scheduled for January 3rd. I almost didn't go. The idea of sitting in a circle with other sick people, sharing our misery, seemed unbearable. But on January 3rd, I found myself walking through the doors of St. Andrew's Community Center. The group was smaller than I'd expected, maybe a dozen people, ranging from their 40s to their 80s. What struck me immediately was that most patients weren't alone. They had spouses, adult children, siblings, people who'd chosen to face this disease alongside them. I watched an elderly man, probably in his late 70s, gently wipe drool from his wife's chin. She was further along in the disease than I was, her body curled and rigid, her speech nearly unintelligible. But the tenderness in his gesture, the way he smiled at her and told her she was doing great, it brought tears to my eyes. This, I thought, is what marriage looks like. This is what Richard couldn't do. After the formal meeting, a woman named Patricia approached me. She was around my age with short gray hair and a walker. "First time?" she asked kindly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "It gets better," she said. "Not the disease, that's the same for all of us. But being here with people who understand, it helps." Over the following months, the support group became my anchor. I learned coping strategies for managing symptoms. I discovered exercises that helped with rigidity. Most importantly, I found community. Patricia became a close friend. She'd been living with Parkinson's for 12 years and had a wealth of practical knowledge. She also had a husband who'd stuck by her, a quiet man named David who drove her to meetings and sat patiently while we talked. "David's a saint," Patricia told me once. "I tell him all the time he should leave me for someone who can still dance with him. You know what he says? 'I married you for your mind, not your motor skills.' Ridiculous, man." But she smiled when she said it, and I felt a stab of jealousy and grief for what I'd lost. Through the group, I also met younger patients. People in their 40s who were facing this disease while still raising children, building careers. Their courage humbled me. Here I was, feeling sorry for myself when others were facing even greater challenges. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. I started writing essays about illness, aging, and resilience. To my surprise, several were published in medical journals and literary magazines. Writing gave me purpose, a way to transform my experience into something potentially useful for others. I also began volunteering at the community center, helping organize the support group meetings, mentoring newly diagnosed patients. Giving back to others somehow made my own struggles more bearable. By 2018, I'd found a kind of equilibrium. The disease was progressing, I needed more medication, my mobility was worse, I'd had to get a cane, but I'd learned to live with it. I had friends, purpose, and a measure of peace. I didn't think about Richard much anymore. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Ashley had married in a small ceremony in the Cotswolds, that he'd semi-retired from the firm, that they were traveling extensively, all the things he'd claimed my illness prevented him from doing. Good for them, I thought without much feeling. I'd moved on. Then came October 2023, 7 years after our divorce. I was at home editing an article I'd written about caregiver burnout when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Hello? Helen? It's Ashley. Her voice was strained, almost unrecognizable. My first instinct was to hang up, but curiosity kept me on the line. What do you want, Ashley? I need to talk to you in person if possible. Please. There was something in her voice, desperation maybe, or exhaustion, that made me agree. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the university, neutral territory. I arrived first, settling at a corner table with a view of the street. The autumn leaves were falling, creating a carpet of gold and red on the sidewalk. I'd always loved this time of year at Oxford. When Ashley walked in, I barely recognized her. The vibrant 30-something I remembered had been replaced by a haggard woman who looked closer to 50. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes wrinkled, her face bare of makeup and etched with stress. She ordered a coffee and sat down across from me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "Thank you for meeting me," she finally said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "What do you want, Ashley?" She took a shaky breath. "Richard is sick. He has Alzheimer's disease, early onset. He was diagnosed 2 years ago, but it's progressing rapidly." I felt a jolt of shock, followed by something more complicated, not quite satisfaction, but a grim acknowledgement of irony. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. I wouldn't wish Alzheimer's on anyone. "It started with small things," Ashley continued, her words tumbling out as if she'd been waiting to tell someone. Forgetting where he'd parked the car, losing his keys, repeating the same stories. I thought it was just stress, or normal aging, but then he got lost driving home from the office, a route he'd taken for 30 years. That's when we saw a doctor. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, though she didn't drink. The diagnosis was devastating, obviously. But I thought I was young, healthy, strong. We'd face it together, just like... She stopped, perhaps realizing what she was about to say. "Just like Richard promised me we would," I finished for her. Ashley flinched, but didn't deny it. "Yes, I thought love would be enough. I thought being there for him, supporting him, would make it bearable. But it's not," I said flatly. "No," she whispered, "it's not. Helen, he doesn't recognize me anymore. He thinks I'm his nurse, or his daughter, or sometimes his mother. He gets angry, violent sometimes. Last week he threw a plate at me because I wouldn't let him drive. He needs constant supervision. I can't work, can't sleep properly, can't have a life outside of caring for him." She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "How did you do it? When he left you? When you were sick and alone? How did you stay so strong?" The question hung in the air. I thought about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, the moments I'd wanted to give up, the crushing loneliness of those first years. "I didn't have a choice," I said simply. "And neither did you. You made yours 7 years ago." Ashley's face crumpled. "I know. God, I know how this looks. The universe's revenge, right? I took your husband when you were sick, and now karma's paying me back." "I don't believe in karma," I said. "This is just life, random and often cruel." "I can't do this anymore," Ashley said, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm only 41. I feel like I'm 80. I have no friends left. They all got tired of me canceling plans. No career, I had to quit the firm. No future, just years of watching Richard disappear. She reached across the table as if to take my hand, then seemed to think better of it. I need advice, Helen. You lived with this disease. You know what it's like. How do I cope? How do I find help? How do I... Her voice broke. How do I keep loving someone who's disappearing? I sat back in my chair, looking at this woman who'd once represented everything I'd lost. The younger model, the healthy alternative, the new life Richard had chosen over his obligations to me. You want my advice? I said quietly. Here it is. Find the best care facility you can afford and place Richard there. Visit him regularly if you want or don't, but don't sacrifice your life for someone who wouldn't have done the same for you. Ashley's eyes widened. I can't just abandon him. Why not? He abandoned me. You helped him do it. That was different. How? I interrupted. How was it different? Because he was the patient then and not the caregiver? Because I had Parkinson's instead of Alzheimer's? The principle is the same, Ashley. When things got hard, Richard left. Now things are hard for you, and you want permission to do the same thing. I'm not like Richard, Ashley protested weakly. Maybe not. But you're discovering what I learned 7 years ago, that loving someone in sickness and in health isn't a romantic notion. It's a daily choice to stay when every instinct tells you to run. Richard couldn't make that choice, neither can you, apparently. Ashley was crying openly now. I thought you'd understand. You lived through this. I did. Alone, because your husband, and yes, he's your husband now, decided his comfort was more important than his vows. I don't owe you understanding or advice or absolution. I gave 35 years to that man. He gave me nothing when I needed him most. I stood up, gathering my coat and bag. Wait, Ashley said desperately. Please, I just need... What? Permission? Forgiveness? I can't give you either. I looked at her for a long moment, but I will say this. Whatever you decide to do about Richard's care, make sure it's something you can live with, because unlike him, you'll have to face yourself in the mirror every day. I left her sitting there, and I walked out into the autumn afternoon feeling something I hadn't expected, freedom. Not from bitterness or anger, but from any lingering sense that I'd somehow failed in my marriage. Seeing Ashley broken and desperate had shown me that my marriage hadn't ended because I was sick. It had ended because Richard was weak. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about the meeting. She listened quietly, then said something I'll never forget. Some people only grow strong when they have no other choice. Richard never had to, so he didn't. You didn't have that luxury. She was right. My disease had forced me to find strength I didn't know I had. Richard's disease was doing the same for Ashley, but unlike me, she'd chosen this man knowing exactly what he was capable of when times got tough. I learned later, through those same mutual acquaintances, that Ashley did eventually place Richard in a memory care facility. A nice one, expensive, but she placed him nonetheless. She went back to work part-time at a smaller architecture firm. She visits Richard twice a month, I'm told, though he doesn't recognize her. Some people said she was heartless. Others said she was practical. I thought she was probably both, and I felt no particular need to judge her either way. As for Richard, I have no desire to see him. I don't hate him. Hate requires too much energy, and I need all of mine for living. But I don't forgive him either. Forgiveness suggests that what he did was understandable, even acceptable under the circumstances. It wasn't. I'm 69 years old now. The Parkinson's has progressed, as we knew it would. I use a walker most days. My speech is slower. Some tasks that used to be simple, buttoning a shirt, opening a jar, are now impossible without help. But I've learned to adapt. I still write, though I use voice-to-text software now. I still attend the support group, though now I'm one of the veteran members, offering encouragement to newcomers. I've published a collection of essays about living with chronic illness that's been well received. I've spoken at conferences, appeared on podcasts, become something of an advocate. More importantly, I've built a life rich in friendship and purpose. Janet and I have dinner every Tuesday. Patricia and I take gentle walks when the weather's nice. I have a reading group, a writing group, and a circle of people who value me not despite my illness, but for who I am in totality. Last month, a young woman newly diagnosed with Parkinson's came to the support group. She was terrified, crying, convinced her life was over. Her husband had accompanied her, but sat apart, looking shell-shocked. After the meeting, she approached me. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you stay positive?" I thought about how to answer her. "I don't always," I admitted. "Some days are very hard. But I've learned that strength isn't the same as happiness, and surviving isn't the same as thriving. You have to decide what kind of life you want, even within the constraints of disease, and then fight for it." "But what if—" She glanced at her husband, lowered her voice. "What if my husband can't handle it? What if he leaves?" I looked at her husband, who was talking quietly with Patricia's David. He looked scared but present, engaged there. "Then you'll discover what you're made of," I told her gently, "and you'll be surprised by your own resilience. But don't borrow tomorrow's troubles. Some people run when things get hard, others stay. Give him the chance to be who he is." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and went back to her husband. He immediately put his arm around her, pulled her close. I saw her relax into him, and I felt a bittersweet pang. Grief for what I'd lost, but also genuine hope for them. I've learned something important in these past years. The disease took my health, yes, but Richard's abandonment gave me something unexpected. It freed me from the illusion that I needed him to survive. For 35 years, I'd built my identity partly around being his wife. When that was stripped away, I had to discover who Helen Anderson was on her own. It turned out she was stronger than I'd given her credit for. I don't tell this story to gain sympathy or to paint myself as a victim. I tell it because it's the truth, and the truth has value. Marriage vows are easy to make when you're young and healthy and the future seems infinite. But their real test comes later, when bodies fail and lives get complicated and staying requires sacrifice. Some people passed that test. Richard didn't. And while that caused me tremendous pain, it also taught me that my worth isn't dependent on someone else's ability to love me through difficulty. I am valuable, sick or healthy, married or divorced, tremoring or still. I wish I'd learned that lesson earlier. I wish I'd learned it some other way, but I've learned it nonetheless, and that knowledge sustains me now more than Richard's presence ever could have. To young people entering marriage, I would say this: pay attention not to how your partner acts when things are easy, but how they respond when you're at your worst. Do they stay? Do they help? Do they see your suffering and choose to shoulder part of the burden? Or do they calculate the cost to themselves and quietly start looking for the exit? Richard taught me that love isn't what people say, it's what they do when there's nothing left to gain and everything to lose. By that measure, he never really loved me at all. He loved the idea of me, the version of me that was useful and convenient, and asked nothing difficult of him. And Ashley? I think she learned the same lesson I did, though she came to it from the other side. She thought she was getting the better deal, a successful, charming man, free from the burden of a sick wife. Instead, she got a man who'd already demonstrated exactly who he was when the going got tough. That's the real irony, isn't it? She won the prize she thought she wanted, only to discover it was exactly what I'd escaped. I'm sitting here in this coffee shop now, the same one where Ashley and I met a year ago, watching students rush by with their books and their youth and their certainty that they have all the time in the world. Once I was one of them. Now I'm the older woman with the walker and the tremor and the hard-earned wisdom. If I could go back and change things, avoid the Parkinsons, keep Richard, maintain the comfortable life I had, would I? The question isn't as simple as it seems, because the woman I was then, married and healthy and complacent, wasn't truly happy. She was comfortable. She was comfortable in a marriage that looked good from the outside, but was, I can see now, somewhat hollow at its core. Richard and I were companions, yes, but were we truly partners? Did we really know each other? The woman I am now, sick, divorced, living in a small flat, is somehow more authentically herself. I know my limits and my strengths. I know who my real friends are. I know what matters and what doesn't. So no, I wouldn't go back. I'd spare myself the pain if I could, but I wouldn't trade the person I've become. That's my story. Not a cautionary tale exactly, though there are certainly lessons in it. Not a triumph narrative either, though I've survived and even, in my own way, thrived. Just the truth of one woman's journey through betrayal, illness, and ultimately self-discovery. The disease hasn't beaten me. Richard's abandonment didn't destroy me. I'm still here, still fighting, still finding moments of joy and purpose. And that, I think, is its own kind of victory. Quieter and harder won than I'd once imagined, but real nonetheless. I have Parkinson's disease. I will for the rest of my life. It will take more from me as the years go by, but it cannot take my dignity, my value, or my sense of self. Those belong to me alone, and I've learned the hard way that I'm the only person who can surrender them. I choose not to.